Thank you very much. So I'm Irit Mevorak, professor at the University of Nottingham, co-director of the University of Nottingham Commercial Law Centre. And I will be really, really brief because I think this session is going to be particularly interesting and we want to have sufficient time for discussion. So just to quickly add my thanks for the Insolvency Service and in particular Paul Bannister and his team for organizing this wonderful conference. And it's so nice to see so many friends and colleagues here in person. I really missed you. So that is really nice. And also wonderful to see that so many people are joining us remotely for the conference today. So delighted to welcome everyone remotely and in person to this third session on the hot and interesting and important topic, which is the Prepack regime. And this session will include two papers. The first paper is a co-authored paper technical paper by Dr. Mokal, a South Square barrister and honorary professor at the University College London, and Alfonso Nocilla, associate professor from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. So a joint paper, it will be presented primarily by Alfonso, and then Riz will join in the last slide to present the sort of the end of the paper. We will then move straight away to the second paper, also on prepacks, that will be presented by Dr. Bolanle Adebola, associate professor at the University of Reading. So both papers are on prepacks, but different perspectives, different methodologies to investigate the effectiveness of our prepack regime. And so without further ado, over to you, Alfonso. We will do the papers one after the other, and then open it to questions from the floor. We are going to have enough time for that. So both questions from the remote participants and from the floor. So think, listen, and we are looking forward to comments and discussions. Over to you, Alfonso.
I have the...
Okay.
Thank you so much for pronouncing my name better than most Italians would pronounce it. It's wonderful. It's the only time it's ever happened at a conference. So thank you so much to the Insolvency Service for inviting me and to Aston University for hosting. It's my first conference in person since the pandemic hit. And it is nice to be back in the UK after having done my PhD here a few years ago at UCL. And thanks to Riz, of course, for agreeing to co-author this paper with me. Paper is modestly titled Rehabilitating Prepacks, a Framework for Fine-Tuning the New Regulations. So I should, of course, mention the CIGA, which came into force last year, as you know, the new regulations on connected party prepacks, which are really an extension of Parliament's powers under the CIGA to regulate in this area. And our two broad questions in this paper were, do we need these regulations? Why do we need them? And are they likely to be effective, or how effective are they likely to be? So let me begin by providing a little bit of background to prepacks, going back to the system that existed before the Enterprise Act 2002 changed the process of administration in the UK, as I've argued elsewhere, quite fundamentally, I think. So originally, of course, administration under the Insolvency Act 1986 was not a standalone process. It was typically used in conjunction with something else, like a CVA, a liquidation, and so on, so that distributions could be made to creditors. In addition, the administrator could only be appointed, of course, with the consent of every creditor who had the ability to appoint an administrative receiver. Now, why was it structured that way prior to the Enterprise Act 2002? Well, you look at the reasoning in the Cork report. Administrative receivership was thought to be a particularly beneficial procedure. It was unfortunate, in the view of the authors of the Cork report, that administrative receivership was unavailable to certain companies, which lacked a secured creditor, either who was able to appoint an administrative receiver because they held a qualified floating charge, or because they were unwilling to do so. So the rationale behind the administration process introduced after Cork was to extend the benefits, the purported benefits of administrative receivership to those types of companies. That approach, of course, followed the Cork report's recommendation. So the old form of administration, you might argue, was a form of administrative receivership. And in that connection, it's helpful, I think, to keep in mind two other procedures, which are arguably variations of what today are prepacks. The first would be accelerated sales, such as the one in T&D Industries PLC in 2000. In that type of transaction, the sale is negotiated before the creditors have decided, before they voted, but after the administrator is appointed, rather than prior to the administrator's appointment in a prepack. The second we might term is a sort of hybrid prepack, wherein the parties proposing the prepack ask the court to sort of bless the transaction, ask the court to appoint the administrator rather than doing an appointment out of court. Why would you ever do that? Well, perhaps if the parties in support of the prepack are concerned about potential challenges to the deal. In some cases, it might also be because of the existence of a winding up order, right, that precludes the appointment out of court. But I mention these, and I should say, to be clear, of course, the court appointing the administrator doesn't insulate the deal from being challenged later. But at least from the point of view of some creditors, it does give them a sort of leg up, as it were, in ensuring that it's harder to challenge. Creditors can still challenge under paragraphs 74 and 75 of Schedule B1 of the Insolvency Act, of course. But the point that I make in mentioning all of these procedures is that you can sort of think of them as falling on a spectrum. You have prepacks, which give significant power, I would say, significant control to the owner-managers of these companies, with the blessing largely of the secured creditors, right? And you can think of the significant benefits to owner-managers, especially in connected sales. And at the same time, there is this tradition of courts deferring to the commercial decisions of administrators. So if you think of the spectrum, prepacks on the one end and perhaps sort of full administration on the other end, you have accelerated sales and hybrid prepacks that sort of fall elsewhere in between the two on the spectrum. But certainly prepacks, when you look at the level of deference that's given by the courts, when you look at the level of control for a relatively small group of stakeholders, prepacks are much closer to administrative receiverships. At least that's the general argument. But returning to the origins of the prepack, sometime after administration was introduced under the IA 1986, it was recognized that administrative receivership was perhaps not the best approach, right, for rescuing distressed businesses. And in particular, that the outcomes for unsecured creditors were rather poor, right? And the concern, I think, goes back to a point that Sue mentioned in a few of her slides earlier, which is one of dispersed creditor control, right? So there's too much control given to a small group of creditors, secured creditors, owner managers, and that leads to undesirable outcomes. So the idea behind the Enterprise Act 2002 is simply we don't want, as the government said, good companies to go to the wall unnecessarily. Where an offer is made that's sufficient to satisfy the secured creditor's claim and the administrative receiver's costs at the same time, there would appear to be a little incentive for them to seek a delay in the procedure that might lead to a better result for other creditors down the line. So an effort was made which culminated in the EA 2002 to transform administration by making it a more robust and standalone process, by dispersing creditor control over the process, more democratic, you might argue. And the hope, as the government stated, was that this would lead to better outcomes for unsecured creditors in particular. So that's the general background of how we got to where we are now. The modern administration procedure is rather different from the one that existed post-Cork. So fast forward a bit to the Graham Review in 2013. The Graham Review, of course, looked very carefully at prepacks. Why? Widespread concern that they were not leading to great results for unsecured creditors. Criticisms about the transparency and accountability of the process, of course. So what were the goals? Well, to assess the long-term impact of these types of procedures, their usefulness, assess whether there is detriment to particular creditors, i.e. preferential and unsecured creditors. We all know about the Graham report. I won't spend time talking about it, although, of course, I owe a debt of gratitude to the quantitative database gathered by Chris Umferwell and Peter Walton. What were some of the key findings of the quantitative study? 2/3 of prepacks were made to connected parties, over 50% deferred consideration in prepacks, 68% in connected transactions. Marketing efforts were said to be insufficient. Independent valuations rarely explained the methodology that they used to reach the valuations. In many of the connected cases, the valuations matched the sale price exactly. Bit of a concern. Unsecureds rarely received anything. You may say, well, so what? In Canada, structuring lawyers say, what's an unsecured creditor? I mean, they rarely get anything, right? The point is, as compared to other procedures, right, as compared to full administration. So again, going back to the purposes of the Enterprise Act 2002, I'm not trying to be pedantic in mentioning it, but if the idea was to improve the outcomes for all concerned and make the process more collective, one of the lines in the Graham Review that once I read it, I couldn't forget it was, well, this looks a lot like administrative receivership. Yeah, it does, at least insofar as the returns to unsecured creditors haven't really moved much. The needle hasn't moved much, as it were. So that's what Graham remarked. So what did the Graham Review recommend in response? Graham found a particularly clear link to business failure in connected party sales and to poor outcomes for unsecured creditors in connected party sales, and therefore recommended a few things: creation of a pre-pack pool, viability reviews of new companies. Skip ahead a bit. Trying to keep time. And evaluators should have insurance, right? So we're familiar with that. A light touch approach in the sense that Graham suggested voluntary compliance with these best practices, and then, well, let's wait and see if the market takes them up. So fast forward a few years. We've now covered 40 years of insolvency law history in England. Fast forward several years. Did the market adopt these voluntary best practices? Well, not really. Statistics from the pre-pack pool show that only 28% of connected sales were referred to the pool in 2016, that is from November 1st, 2015. Meanwhile, 51% of all pre-packs during that same period were connected pre-packs. That number fell to 11% in 2017. Meanwhile, pre-packs or connected pre-packs increased to 57% of the total number of pre-packs. The pool itself, on its website, and its directors have stated that it doesn't really have any powers as such. As Stuart Hopewell commented in an article of the Financial Times in 2018, he's seen cases where the pre-pack was specifically designed to avoid liabilities. It wasn't kosher, and the pool, disappointingly, was unable to do anything, lacked the powers to do anything. There was no consequence where the connected purchaser declined to submit the proposed transaction for the pool's review. There are additional causes for concern, I think, when looking at the CIP 16 compliance rates, which the Insolvency Service, of course, reports in its reports, but is now gathering compliance data from the professional bodies. So from November 1st, 2015 to the end of 2016, when the Insolvency Service was monitoring these reports directly for compliance. 38% of the reports were non-compliant. That fell to 23% in 2019, a lower number, but it's important to note that since 2017, a number of the recognized professional bodies changed the methodology for assessing compliance to a risk-based approach. Now, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of the reporting is that in 2015, 2016, there were 401 reports reviewed, which was roughly the number of prepacks during that time, roughly the total number that were reported during that time. 2017, that fell to about half under the new model, and that sort of trend has continued since then. So the service, I think, is correctly pointed out that there's still some cause for concern here, even though the number has fallen. I would say there may be cause for concern in the shift in methodology as well. To all this, we can add the findings of the quantitative study that I conducted with Riz Mokal and Nigel Balmer, which culminated in the UK national report submitted to the European Commission as part of a larger research project titled Contractualized Distress Resolution in the Shadow of the Law, which informed the new restructuring directive in the EU. This report contains the largest quantitative database on administrations gathered to date, with over 2,000 of them in England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, plus a sample of 500 administrative receiverships from 2002, which was the last year in which they occurred. The study contains many data points. I won't bore you. Suffice it to say, I've looked at enough CIP 16 reports at this point to require therapy. So I was thinking of the colleague earlier who also does quantitative research. What were some of the things that we found in the report, as you can see there? Durations of prepacks, very interestingly, were not significantly better than other types of administrations, which is interesting, I say, because many proponents of prepacks say these are one of the benefits purportedly is that they're much shorter, right? So going concern sale administrations and piecemeal sale administrations, as we classified them, had modestly longer durations. So 11.8 months was the median duration of a prepack versus 12 months for going concern sale administrations. So not a huge difference. Direct cost savings were also not really significant. Prepacks had average direct costs of 61.5% of total realizations, compared with 64.6% in going concern sale administration. So, it doesn't necessarily prove that prepacks are a bad thing at all. And indeed, there may be, and I think you can make a good case for prepacks where they preserve the business. Shorter durations, of course, can result in savings in terms of indirect costs as well. So there's a strong case to be made there. But at least so far as the scholarship is concerned, where proponents of prepacks say they're much shorter, they're much quicker, they're much cheaper. The data don't seem to support that. Total realizations in prepacks were roughly half on average of realizations in going concern sale administrations across just about every category. So for companies with less than £500,000 in debt, which I think would be most of the types of companies that we're talking about in prepacks, average realizations were £549,000 versus going concern sale administrations at 1.1 million. Prepacks yielded higher returns to secured creditors, perhaps unsurprisingly if you take my argument that they're similar to administrative receiverships in many ways, but lower returns to unsecureds and preferential creditors as compared with other types of administration, and again controlling for other factors. Connected sales had much lower rates of business survivability, along with higher rates of deferred consideration and higher costs. So in the case of connected sales, survival after 5 years was 65% versus 75% in going concern sale administrations. After 10 years, connected prepacks had a 50% chance of survival versus 62% in going concern sale administrations. Now, there's no particular reason I would suggest to think that post-Graham this has improved significantly, simply because the Graham recommendations were not really taken up voluntarily by the market. as I think the Insolvency Service has pointed out, there are still some causes for concern here, which bring us to the new regulations. There is, I think, a clear need to enhance the performance of prepacks, in particular connected party prepacks. Clearly, connected sales are the worst of the lot, as it were. So connected sales are prohibited now during the first 8 weeks, unless creditors can obtain a qualifying, or unless the creditors are interested in approving it, or a qualified report is obtained, meaning the connected party needs a third-party evaluator to report on the consideration to be paid, a statement as to whether the consideration is reasonable, and provide information on the connected party. That report, of course, must be filed with Companies House. But in our view, I think we could and should be broader and encourage a more robust regulation here. And the starting point, I think, is to ask, what are the incentives, and how do we create the appropriate incentives for evaluators, for example, to scrupulously scrutinize the deal, incentives for the owner-managers or connected parties to self-regulate, or to actually go out and get an evaluator who's going to be rigorous. What mechanisms are available for dissenting creditors to meaningfully challenge the deal, that is, to hold the evaluator to account, for instance. So, as we say here, regulate where the expected costs are likely to be offset by the expected benefits, of course. And consider creating the appropriate ex-ante incentives. And I think of this in terms of legal and market incentives, right? Legal being regulation, penalties, of course, but also market incentives, like reputational factors. And here, I think we can go back to a point that's been made before about the incentives for IPs, in some cases, to cultivate a reputation for being accommodating. Think of that in terms of prepacks, where the directors of the insolvent company are going to be less likely to select an IP who may be too, who maybe will scrutinize the deal too carefully. How are we doing for time? Okay.
So three more minutes for you. And
so I'll go quick. Perfect. So I'll go quickly. That's it. Yeah. 3 minutes is enough, right? So legal and market incentives, reputational being one, and I would suggest there's a strong reputational incentive there, or a strong market, I guess, disincentive for IPs to cast themselves as being, too rigorous in reviewing, and so too then for evaluators as well. And so, what are the mechanisms in the new regulations to really hold evaluators to account? I'll leave it to Riz to suggest some ways that we might address that, but just keep in mind that the evaluators are to be picked by connected parties. Why pick one over another? Well, we'll leave that thought there. So, so that's one thought. Point about evaluation rigging, maybe a strong term to use, but go back to the finding of the Graham Review, that in many connected party prepacks, the valuation price from the desktop valuation matched exactly the price that the parties coincidentally came to. So I think you can make an argument for a broader problem that arises with the owner managers of prepacks generally, who have the backing or the tacit approval of secured creditors to pursue a particular transaction rather than a different one. Maybe that extends beyond just connected parties. Won't get into that today, we don't have time. But perhaps I'll just leave on the point that if the aim of the Enterprise Act 2002 was to create a model that dispersed creditor control a bit more, a more sort of representative or democratic model, that would in turn lead to better outcomes for certain types of creditors. There are good theoretical reasons as well as quantitative data to suggest that probably hasn't happened. And then we might ask whether, to some extent, the current regulations could be fine-tuned a bit to address that. And I'll leave it at that. And thank you all very much for your attention.
Let me start by saying that it's a real pleasure and privilege to be sharing a panel with two former students who are now distinguished scholars in their own right. And it's fitting that I'm able to do that on a topic which we discussed many, many years ago together. I discussed with each of Alfonso and Bolanle. By way of summary of what Alfonso has said, first, the world changed or should have changed with the Enterprise Act. Before the Enterprise Act, administration was regarded as a substitute for receivership and as providing the benefits of receivership to companies in relation to whom a receiver would not be appointed. In that context, it was appropriate to allow prepacks to occur as a way of making the administration process function even more like receivership. However, with the Enterprise Act reforms, the world changed. There was an acknowledgement, at least at the legislative and policy level, that receivership was doing harm on balance than good. That was why it was abolished in relation to most types of companies. And it was therefore particularly problematic for the courts. No criticism of the judges concerned. They did what they were advised to do. They listened to the arguments and they made decisions, but it was particularly problematic at a policy level for prepacks to be introduced because prepacks functioned even post-Enterprise Act very much like, too much like, administrative receiverships. Fundamentally, and this is the second crystallizing point, fundamentally a role of insolvency proceedings is to say whether this particular distressed debtor, its business is viable and worth saving, and if so, under this or a new management, or that the distressed business is no longer viable. The proposition on which the business is based is no longer viable. So the assets constituting the business ought to be broken up and recycled to new, more promising uses. And the fundamental problem with the prepack is that it threatens or risks short-circuiting all of the mechanisms that insolvency law has developed to make that sifting possible. There are only three mechanisms. One is decision-making by the outsider parties who know the management and the business the best. Outsider, not the shareholder managers whose performance is being assessed. So who are these parties? It's the creditors as a group, not just the bank, which may have distorted perspectives because it holds security, but all of the creditors as a whole. That's one mechanism. The prepack short circuits that mechanism. The other mechanism is exposure of the business and its constituent assets to the relevant segment of the market for a sufficiently long period of time. That risks being short-circuited by the prepack. And the third mechanism, and really it's the third best or maybe even worse than third best mechanism, is to have an independent decision made, perhaps by a court, but independent decision where the burden of justification is on the party proposing a particular sale of the business, rather than being on parties who ex post seek to challenge the propriety or validity of the sale. Again, the prepack does the opposite. It reverses the burden of justification onto a party seeking to challenge. So those are the problems with the prepack, that it threatens to short-circuit all of the mechanisms by which insolvency law may decide whether this business is worth saving as a going concern, and if so, whether it's worth saving under the existing management trading the current corporate entity or the existing management trading a new corporate entity. And that's the problem about connected party sales. So that's the problem. Here are some of the solutions just put forward for consideration, intended to be somewhat provocative, but also to provoke thought, not just reaction. So one, why shouldn't the evaluator, who at the moment doesn't have sufficient incentives, as Alfonso explained, to cultivate a reputation for rigor? In fact, they have a an incentive to be compliant because they want people coming to them, and people who come to them are connected party owners and shareholders of businesses hoping to go down the pre-pack route. So the incentives are completely perverse. Well, how about making sure that the evaluator has to be a regulated professional? At the moment, the only requirement there is that the regulator should have insurance, and that may indirectly provoke more regulated professionals to act as evaluators. But why leave it to that indirect route? Why not require that the evaluator be a regulated professional of some appropriate description? Second, evaluation shopping. This problem has been looked at and commented at many a time. At the moment, the connected party seeking to go down the pre-pack route can go to a first evaluator, get a report is not favorable, go to a second one, get a report, it's not favorable, go to a third one. Keep shopping until they find a compliant evaluator. And then the only thing that they are required to do is to provide the report which is compliant, which supports the pre-pack. Well, how about dealing with the perversity which comes into the system by requiring that if a pre-pack does occur, all of the relevant parties, including the evaluators who have provided the first couple of reports, send those reports to Companies House for being uploaded. So enhance the transparency of the background to the pre-pack by ensuring that if there has been evaluation shopping, don't ban it if that's considered inappropriate, but at least make it transparent. Third, evaluation rigging. Require similar disclosure of the communications and instructions which have been given between the connected party and the evaluator whose report is relied upon. Again, this responds to the, would it be too harsh to say, sham process that the Graham report talked about, where many desktop evaluations were producing a figure which precisely equaled what the connected party had agreed to pay for the business. So how about making the information which the evaluator is being provided with public, again, in a similar low-cost way, require this information to be uploaded to the company's records at the Companies House. Idea is, once again, to make it transparent exactly what instructions and information were provided to the evaluator. How about legal mechanisms? At the moment, it's not clear whether the evaluator has a duty of care which would be legally enforceable to the parties whose interests are fundamentally at stake in the evaluator's decision. There is a hint in the regulations that the insurance that the evaluator holds should be open to cover claims by any other person. So it's not simply an office holder who, in theory, is envisaged as being able to bring a claim. Any other party might bring a claim, but this is just left implicit. Why not make it explicit that there is a duty to take reasonable care? We've taken a shot at suggesting what the duty may be, but this is just a target for you to shoot at. It may be something very different. Sidestepping of administrators' duties. At the moment, the administrator is only required to provide a statement of reasons in relation to a case not made evaluation where the administrator still chooses to go down the pre-pack route. Why? It's the administrator's statutory responsibility to decide what should happen to the business. The administrator, in choosing to go down the pre-pack, is already short-circuiting the proper discharge as written in the statute of those duties. Why shouldn't it be a duty of the administrator to put their personal credibility on the line by saying, I have approved this pre-pack because, and provide a set of reasons which then become part of the public record. Finally, there's asymmetric information. The manager shareholders would have much more information about the pre-pack process. So would the IP, so might the evaluator, compared to creditors and other interested stakeholders who might wish ex post to challenge. And as any litigator would know, who bears the burden of proof in a litigation context can make all the difference in the world. At the moment, the burden is on, as I said, on parties seeking ex post to challenge the pre-pack. this is, in most cases, even if there may be something there, this is just next to impossible to bring about. Why not reverse the burden of proof? Create ex-ante incentives for the IP who's going to approve a Prepack to create a paper trail, then ex-ante, when the decisions are being made, knowing that if there is a challenge exposed, they would have the burden of justifying what they have done. Again, just ideas for you to think about and perhaps targets for you to shoot at.
Thank you very much, Alfonso and Riz. Very interesting findings and suggestions. And just to throw back to you and to the floor for the later discussion, perhaps an even more radical thought in view of what we've heard earlier today about having too many tools and not necessarily selecting the right type of tools or not developing the right type of expertise in handling the right type of procedures, and the problem of path dependency in choosing certain procedures, and perhaps also path dependency in regulating and policy making. Perhaps we are sticking to an inherently problematic mechanism, the Prepack procedure, and then trying to fix it and fix it again. And should we not more fundamentally rethink a Prepack? So just throwing it to the floor for the later discussions, and moving on straight away to our next research paper, Transforming Perceptions, the Development of Prepack Regulations in England and Wales. And over to you, Dr. Bolanle.
Thank you. Mic works? Yeah. Okay, I have my timer as well, so I'll try and keep in time. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's lovely to speak to such an esteemed audience. This is my first time, I think, of getting on a train since 2019 or something or the other, so it feels like a great, adventure. And it's also interesting that I'm sat on the same side of the table as Riz. That was my first supervisor, and I remember my early meetings with him. He would just speak in tongues as far as I was concerned. I didn't understand anything that he said. But there are a few key things that I took from being Riz's student for all of maybe 1 year, 6 months, thereabouts. Is that Riz invited me to question everything that I saw, even if it was represented in symbols, in numbers. You should interrogate the numbers that are before you and interrogate the system of thinking that went into those numbers. He also encouraged me not to be terrified of economic argument, because it's just one style of argument, and you can take a look at the argument and try and deconstruct. And so although he would, I'm not sure if you would say you're of the law and economics persuasion, he's a contractarian at least, but he approaches things in a more progressive, I think, approach than most of the contractarians that I know, and I have taken those qualities with me going forward. I think the third one that I took was the ability to speak sharply, and I have seen that he's mellowed over the years, and so have I. So we are coming, with our cap in hands, very gently stating our position on the area that we're discussing. So today I'm going to talk about, and my job here really is to unpack quite a bit of the thinking behind some of the decisions that have been made over the past few years. I will look at the Prepack perspectives. I mean, part of me says, why am I giving this paper? Alfonso has given my paper. I might as well, sit down. But at least let me put my 2 cents in to, I did travel on the train this far, and I should have something to say. So I would look to unpack, the thinking behind some of what has been going on for a few years now, and to look at the Prepack perspective, some of the thinking behind the positions that have been taken by some of the key actors, to look at the framework, to look at the regulatory reform that we've had this year, and then to give a few of my own concluding thoughts. And I thought that, I think that often when I put myself in the scene, people tend not to like it when I say, this is what I think. And so I've taken to saying back to people what other people that are more eminent than I am, what it is that they think about what's going on. And so instead of calling from my paper or assuming or projecting thoughts onto other people, I have brought in the words used by people that I think we all agree with to set out the perspectives that there are. So we know that there is a positive view of prepacks. I'm not sure what Peter's position is. I remember prepacking in England and Wales and a few other papers where he took a slightly sharper view of the prepacks. And then, you know, the Wolverhampton report came out. And I'm like, I'm not sure, you know, exactly where... Oh, okay. I didn't want to say that. I wasn't sure where he was anymore on prepacks. But it looks like everyone that has gone in to look at prepacks have come out with a more positive view of prepacks than when it was that they went in. And so we have the Graham Review. I know that Teresa Graham, at least the report says that when I went in, I had some ideas of the prepack, and she came out saying that the prepacks definitely have a place in the insolvency arena. She goes on to say, but, you know, it has problems. We have the 2020 prepack report, and Lord Callanan saying, look, he recognizes that prepack sales are a valuable part of the insolvency landscape and that they can be a useful tool. Now, this doesn't mean that the people who have a positive view of the prepack do not recognize that there are challenges with the prepack. And so we have the Frisbee report, which was the first, you know, key report on the prepack, saying that, look, practitioners themselves are also aware that the appearance of the prepack may be less than positive to those who do not benefit from it. That while interviewees, mainly practitioners, were generally supportive of prepacking in appropriate cases, many expressed considerable concern at the manner in which it might be perceived and at the possibility that it might be the subject of disreputable practice. So we like prepacks, but we recognize that there's a problem with prepacks. Now, that leads easily to, you know, the next set of opinions or the next type of perspective, which is that the prepack is a negative practice and it's not one that we should encourage. Now, there are reasons why prepack is seen negatively, and two main concerns feed this negative perception of the prepack. One is the transparency concern, which Alfonso has already talked about. It's about participation, it's about participating in the negotiation and participating in the approval or refusal of the prepack sale going forward. We also have the issue of connected party sales. Now, there are reasons why people are unhappy, I think, with the connected party sales, and why people are, you know, unhappy with being disenfranchised and the accountability problems. If we looked beyond some of the narrative that we have and looked at the figures that we have been given a little more closely, I think we can begin to understand how the parties align. So we see that mostly prepacks do worse for unsecured creditors. And so we find that in 2007, 2008, Frisbee showed us that they received zero returns in 69% of prepack cases, while they received zero returns in 63% of traditional sales. In 2014, we saw from the Wolverhampton report that 13% of debt was paid back in traditional sales. Just about half of that was paid in prepack sales. And that if you then decided to unpack or separate out or control for sales to connected or unconnected people, you'd find that the figure drops when it comes to connected sales and goes up slightly when it comes to unconnected sales. And so you can begin to see why there is so much unhappiness with the prepack sales, and particularly when the sales are to connected persons. Now, if we look also at the rate of sales to connected persons, we'll find that in most of the prepacks, we have the sales going to connected persons. It has got better, perhaps. We've had fewer with the changes since 2015, but we find that at least 1 in every 2 prepack sale is to a connected person. That's half of the prepacks. And I'd like to put this a bit more in perspective. You know, it's one thing to say that prepacks represent just a tiny drop of all insolvencies, But it is not all insolvencies that you're supposed to juxtapose the Prepack to. You're supposed to juxtapose the Prepack to all going concern sales that you have. And when you juxtapose the Prepack to all going concern sales, well, that's your main insolvency procedure. That's your main rescue procedure in England and Wales or in the UK. And so if you have the main rescue procedure going wrong, you're going to get sustained grumbling. That's exactly what is happening. Now, it's not only the returns. So someone can say, yeah, but the returns were abysmal anyway on either side, whether traditional sales or Prepacks, never mind that they're much worse in Prepack sales. But look at the failure rate. The Prepack sales to connected persons fail at twice the rate, at least almost twice the rate, of Prepack sales to unconnected persons. Now, not only are these unsecured creditors getting less, they know that down the line the business is likely to fail again. About 1 in 3 of them would fail again, and they would also be the ones to suffer this failure in future. Now, that's the position of your unsecured creditors. You'd understand now that it's not simply a question of perception. Knowledge places, the facts place the reason why they would be unhappy squarely against, the Prepack. Now let's look at the reasons why the secured lenders, they have never come out to say that they support Prepacks, but we can understand the reasons why they might agree to the Prepack, or at least nicely acquiesce to the use of the Prepack. Now again, if you look at the way that the figures stack up, you'd find that in terms of returns to the secured creditors, the Prepacks returns more to secured creditors than the traditional sales would return to the secured creditors. And in cases where the returns are above the 50% mark, you find that the Prepack does considerably better than the traditional sales. So of course, if you ask me, Bolanle, where would you put your money? If I were a secured creditor, well, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, go in the direction of Prepacks, because that's where I'm going to get my money from. Why on earth would I want you to go into a long-drawn traditional sale? So that's the thinking behind and the facts behind the perspectives that we have of the debate that is going on. Now, I'm not here to bash, practitioners or to bash, anyone, because we also know that the practitioners and the reason why I would use the practitioners is that they're the main proponents of the Prepack practice. Now, it is not that they are not unmindful of the challenges of the Prepack, and if anything at all, one of the things that the practitioners too have been concerned about have been issues around, confidence in our insolvency system, the integrity of our insolvency system, and of course, the pride in knowing that you're doing a good job and a job that is liked by the people that are using the service. And for that reason, they inaugurated the Frisbee report, and they have encouraged, a regulatory system for Prepacks over a long period of time. And this was what led to the introduction of Prepack regulation in the UK. Now, again, I want to unpack the approaches that we have taken to Prepack regulation, again, to show where the perspectives diverge. So initially, what the practitioners, in the early stages, I think in the early 2004, 2005, leading up to 2007, thereabouts, you had this debate that was going on around how to approach Prepack regulation. And the main concern at the time was the transparency concern. Although by 2009, with the Frisbee report, it was clear that it was not only a transparency concern, we also had a connected party concern. But the focus was not on that connected party concern, it was mainly on the transparency concern. And what people said, or what the main thoughts were that we only need to give more information to people, unsecured creditors, about the Prepack. And for that reason, what they believed was necessary was what I term as review rights. So you give the unsecured creditors the ability to review what had taken place. But that's not what the unsecured creditors wanted. The unsecured creditors wanted what I describe as preview rights. That is the ability to oversee the deal that was going to be made. But it was not simply a question of wanting preview rights. What they actually wanted, in fact, was what I describe as enhanced preview rights. It is not only knowing that a deal was taking place or negotiating the deal along with the other stakeholders on the table. It was the ability to stop a deal that they considered unfavorable to them. Now, that was what made, or that was what would have made the difference to them. And it wasn't just unsecured creditors. If you look at some of the debates that have been taking place in the government rooms, you'd find that the understanding that people had when you said you were going to give regulatory, design a regulatory system would be to both participate in the deal making and to stop bad deals. And in the paper, I set, I quote some of the things that have been said. So what did we have in the UK over the years? We first had the CIP 16 that was introduced, and the CIP 16 gave disclosure responsibilities. So what we had was review rights. It was at that time unimaginable that anyone would grant preview rights to on the prepacks. Now, that was modified slightly in 2013 to deal with valuations and more disclosures, but there were still preview rights, or review rights, rather. And then we had the Graham Review and the report that came after that and the changes that were introduced. And we moved from review rights to preview rights. But let's look at the nature of the preview rights that we're given. So we were given the introduction of the Prepack pool. And what the Prepack pool was actually brought in to look at was not the deal. The Prepack pool was only brought in to look at the decision to prepack. And they were to inform whether that decision to prepack had been reasonably made. Now, even if they thought that the deal was bad, but that the decision to prepack had been made reasonably, then they were going to turn in a positive response. And in fact, one of the cases that has been described as the bête noire of the Prepack pool was the case of Polestar. This is Britain's largest printing company that failed shortly after the Prepack pool had given a positive review. Now, it's been described as one of those off cases. It was odd. We don't know what happened there. But I know what happened. What happened was easy. The Prepack pool had been approached because it was a connected sale. And the Prepack pool had looked at the decision to prepack and had decided that the decision to prepack that had been told to it was reasonably made. And so they had said, well, that decision is reasonable, go ahead. But by the time the suppliers knew what had happened, they decided that that was a bad deal, that was a bad company, and they were not going to agree to the novation of their contracts, and so they would not continue to supply the company. This was just typical of what would happen with the Prepack pool. And if you left the Prepack pool to continue to run on those bases, we would have had more and more and more of those cases. And all that would have happened would have been that the legitimacy of the Prepack pool, which had been welcomed when it was introduced by the unsecured creditors because it gave them a lot of comfort, it would have delegitimized the Prepack pool before the eyes of the very people whose perceptions we needed to change. And so what we have, or the way that I describe what's happening, is that we have a gap in expectations between what your unsecured creditors who hold these negative perceptions of the Prepack have and the perceptions of what the practitioners and I don't know where the regulators sit on this, have of the Prepack process and how the Prepack system should be regulated. Now, it's important to understand when people talk about the expectation gap that, again, you need to unpack that expectation gap. An expectation gap itself is full of several gaps, and it's been studied in various areas. But the one I think is most pertinent to us would be how it's been studied in the world of audit, because I think that the closest alignment to the evaluator you would have, or the Prepack pool you would have, would be between an auditor and someone else who's reviewing decisions that have been made by other people. And so you have within the expectation gap reasonable expectations of the public and unreasonable expectations of the public. The public assumes that when an audit statement has been given, it means that the company is great and its finances are great, and they assume that the auditors have looked at everything that there is to be looked at, and they have made a decision that has looked at everything. But that's not quite true. And so there is a reasonable gap, the gap between what auditors can reasonably be expected to do and what the public expects of them. We also have a performance gap. That is the gap between what the public perceives the office holder to do and what the law requires the office holder to do. Now, within that performance gap, what drives the actions of the office holder is actually two things. One would be their ability to perform, but the other would be the standards that determine the actions that they're supposed to take, their duties and their responsibilities. And if you have deficient standards, then you would have deficient performance, and then that would continue to feed the expectation gap that exists between perceptions of the process and the way the process works. Now, how do you close an expectation gap? First of all, there are three main things feeding the expectation gap. One is the understanding of the office holders. The other is the understanding of the public. And the third is the nature of the standards that you have. And so you're going to have to close all three or address all three in order to close that gap. Now, there are two main approaches that have been suggested. One is a defensive approach, and that's what you would usually have from the practitioners. Actually, it says 4 minutes. I am checking. He told me never to believe. And what you would expect, what you expect from the practitioners. The practitioners always want a defensive approach. Educate the public. If they understood better, they would realize that we're doing our best and we're doing what is necessary, and they have unreasonable expectations of us. But it's not simply education that is necessary. You also have to improve any deficient standards that are. And it's not enough to do one or the other. In order to close the gap, you have to both educate and close the deficient standards that there are. Now, let's look at what has happened. I'm going to skip this because Alfonso has talked about it. I would just say, you talked about the fact that valuation met the desktop valuation, but it's interesting that they found that 2 in 5 companies paid less than that valuation, and 1 in 4 of them paid, I think, 25% less than the valuation that has been given. So that, yes, we're improving the valuation, but I'm not sure what difference it's making. Another is what I would say about the marketing principles. So the way the insolvency practitioners themselves approach this. Now, we've moved from 1 in 2 companies, Prepacks, being marketed to 3 in 4 being marketed. But guess what? There are 6 marketing principles, 3 talking about how you market and 3 talking about the approach that the practitioner has taken. Now, the box that the practitioners have ticked in the main have been the box about how it is that they have approached this. So even if they didn't undertake any marketing, they're going to explain what it is that they have done, and they're going to tick it, and that is where you find the bulk of the actions in relation to marketing. So it's important to take a closer look at the figures that we had. And in the case of viability review, because this is going to affect the suggestions that I would make, in the case of the viability review, the Prepack report looks at 1 year. It spotlights 1 year. Now, if you looked at the report from Chris and Peter, you'd find that they looked at a bit of a longitudinal study over 3 years. So we've said that although the viability review is not solicited in a good number of the cases, this has not affected the sustainability of the rescued entity. But it's not quite. We looked at 1 year, and according to their report, that the percentage of companies that fail within the first 12 months is just 5%. It is within 36 months that it goes down to 30%. So we actually don't know yet. We don't know that not complying with that, the need for that review is not detrimental or problematic one way or the other. Now, we all know so I'm looking at the time, we all know the reforms that have been introduced, and I'm just going to give my own final thoughts. So I would say that I agree entirely with the opinion that Riz and Alfonso have given, and I will just put in a few extra thoughts. So if we're going to close the gap, then we have to look at the nature of the gap and the best way of closing those gaps. Now, in terms of deficient standards, what we did was introduce, creditor approval, which is what gives the enhanced preview rights. They can oversee and they can stop a bad deal, a deal they consider bad. But if you looked at the qualifying report, you can oversee the deal, but you cannot stop that deal from going forward, because the administrator has the power to still put the deal through, even though an evaluator has said that a case for that deal is not made. And interestingly, I would simply say that we're supposed to work back from the nature of the concerns that we're trying to deal with. So if we're trying to deal with the negative concerns, that's it. 1 minute. If we're trying to deal with the negative concerns around the Prepack, and we're looking to give comfort to the unsecured creditor, then we have to face the fact that connected Prepacks fail, and they fail at twice the rate of unconnected Prepacks. Therefore, if they cannot, after shopping around for an evaluator, find an evaluator that would say, send the deal through, then there should be no circumstance under which an administrator should complete a deal where no evaluator can say, this is an okay deal. It should not be put through, because you take away the comfort that you claim that the law is giving to the people. And the other part of it would be, just because I have 1 more minute, is the responsive, the responsive approach. So both the expectation gap theory approach, and if we look at regulatory approach as well, both of them talk about this iterative relationship between the regulator and the regulated. We don't have a regulated when it comes to the evaluator. And so if we need to combine education with better standards, then we have no one to evaluate or no one to educate, because we don't have a body of evaluators. So it means that we have to do a lot more in creating the body of people that we're to engage with by way of evaluators. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bolanle. That was really well presented and very interesting, and we're eager to get some reactions from the floor, so start raising your hands. We will take a number of comments and reactions, and then we will give you the chance to pick what to answer. And while you're thinking about it and start raising your hands, I will just mention some questions from the remote participants, and in particular the focus here is on the role of the insolvency practitioners. So sort of summarizing the questions here on the insolvency practitioners, the question is whether they have the key role here. It is incumbent on them to justify the Prepack, and this is based on CIP 16. If the opinion of the insolvency practitioner is clearly wrong, then they will face sanctions. And so the elephant in the room is the IP regulation and Prepacks work when put up by good IPs. So the question is whether the problem actually lies in IP regulation. And now taking some more questions, reactions from the floor. Yeah, Gerard.
Hi, Era. Thank you very much indeed. They were both very fascinating papers. Very quick, my name is Jerry McCormick, by the way. Just a very quick question. I've attended lots of presentations and spoken to a lot of Americans say, Chapter 11, it works great, like debtor in possession, but we need court approval for any sales outside the normal course of business. Say, why don't you do that in the UK? I say, well, the court system is very different. Is there a better answer?
Thanks, Gary. We will come back to that. More, yeah. So, Caroline. Yeah.
I think I just want to agree with the comment that the Prepack legislation, whatever you do with it, is never going to give creditors what they want, which is their money back and to stop the directors from carrying on a company where the perception is that they haven't suffered in the same way that the creditors have.
Thanks, Caroline.
Can I add a comment?
Wait, we're taking some more. Others? Yeah. Yeah.
Just quickly, I think there's another dimension which hasn't really been touched on, which is the role of clients and the people who companies are looking after. So I've done a couple of Prepacks, two last year, both to unconnected. So I'm quite comfortable with them. I'm quite happy that it was the best possible deal for everyone, but particularly for the people at the sharp end of the process, facing an insolvency process You know, they were in respite care homes. They were vulnerable individuals. You can't go into an insolvency process and try and explain to carers how their, you know, loved ones are going to be looked after or whatever. They need certainty. You need to find the right solutions for those clients. And I've also done professional practices where, again, huge issues with the regulators. If you want to try and trade a professional practice, you've got to find the solutions to protect the clients. And it is, by the way, the best deal at the end of the day for creditors.
So is it the best deal, and is certainty the most important aspect? Inga?
Thank you, Inga West. I don't dispute any of the figures, but I do wonder at the connected party sales contain a high concentration of fairly small businesses for whom actually the connected party may be the only possible buyer. And in that case, it's then a choice of do you sell the business or not? And even if it does fail, it still might be the best possible solution to creditors. That obviously hides a multitude of sins, but I do wonder whether it slightly skews the figures in that respect.
Peter.
Thank you. I've just got a thought with regard to thinking back to what Sue was talking about this morning in terms of encouraging CVAs. I've always thought one of the problems with connected party prepacks is that creditors feel that everybody gets to start from a clean sheet again and that they don't benefit from any positive trading by NewCo. So I've always, not always, but for about 10 years, I've advocated that if NewCo makes a profit, that ought to be shared with the creditors of OldCo. And that might make the decision whether or not to go down a CVA or a connected party prepack a more interesting equation.
Interesting. Paul?
Thanks. I was interested by the way the slides showed the evolution of the regulatory system bit by bit by bit, and the suggestions you had for what might be the next evolution of the regulatory system. I wondered really, though, what would be the outcome of the suggestions that you had up there? Would it actually make prepacks harder, and so there would be less of them? Or is it actually you're trying to make them better to give more confidence? I wasn't quite sure which of the two it did.
Any more questions or comments? Or if not, back to our speakers. So you have 3 minutes each. So please, Alfonso, then Riz, then Bolanle. Okay?
Thank you. Well, let me just say a few things quickly. One is I'm mindful of the fact that I'm an academic speaking about what practitioners do. The other is that I'm a colonial, so coming from a Canadian perspective and here criticizing some aspects of your insolvency system, rest assured that I'm extremely critical of the Canadian system as well when I have the opportunity to be, which is frequently. I think one thing that I would stress when trying to say something positive is that when we looked at the data and we looked at over 500 receiverships from 2002, the last year that administrative receiverships were done before they were abolished. And then we looked at the data for full administrations. Administration has been wildly successful. The new form since the Post-Enterprise Act has been wildly successful compared with administrative receiverships. And again, this was the largest quantitative study done to date. That, I think, has put the nail in the coffin of claims from some, I guess, holdouts who really thought that administrative receivership was the superior procedure. So I think that the UK regulators and Parliament should be commended for having brought in that process. The one blemish on that process has been prepacks, and I think you can talk about individual cases, and I've had this debate with practitioners in my own country, where it was the only option, and maybe some of these companies are just bottom of the barrel, and this is the only way to salvage it. Perfectly fine. I don't think anyone on this panel thinks we should be getting rid of prepacks, or that we should be making it harder to prepack. I think the key is, first of all, creating sufficient transparency in the process so that we can tease out the reasons for the decision to prepack in a way that is defensible, right? Theoretically, normatively defensible, practically defensible from the perspective of creditors who are going to lose out, right? And why is that so important? Because in the cases where you need creditor buy-in, where you need stakeholder participation, you must encourage, so far as possible, the belief in the integrity of the system. Once you've lost that, there's no way of measuring what the damage could be. So that's really important. And then, of course, creating the appropriate incentives for providing that transparency and providing accountability. I mean, you know, one of the questions is, well, what are we doing with all of these different processes? Why should we? I mean, create as many processes as you want. The English system, one of the hallmarks of the English system has been that you have a multiplicity of proceedings. In Canada, we had very few types of proceedings. Guess what happened? The courts create new proceedings because that's what the market demands. So I don't think the problem is necessarily that you have a multiplicity of proceedings or that you have prepacks per se. It's a question of why are they being pursued, and can we actually, as Bolanle suggested, interrogate that in a meaningful way. So that's all. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll just take 1 minute and then give my remaining time to Bolanle for her part of the questions. My point is, I think it's a fundamentally defeatist attitude to say, oh, creditors want the impossible, and since we can't deliver the impossible, therefore we shouldn't try. I think that the comparison between administrative receivership and the new administration shows very unequivocally from the data, from the empirical evidence, that regulating properly and putting the correct legal mechanisms in place, by which I mean creating the correct structures of duty and accountability, makes a significant real-world difference to creditors and other stakeholders. It can be done. So the question now is whether we are content that the prepack regulations in this jurisdiction create the right incentives. And I think you've heard two presentations from the three of us today, which suggest that the burden of whose suggestion is that at the moment, on balance, there is insufficient, too much perverse incentives being created for too many players in the system, and too few of the right incentives being created by the regulatory framework. And as you saw, our slide did not say anything about abolishing the prepack. It did not say anything about making prepacks more difficult. All of the points that I put up on the slide are low-cost points, perhaps with the exception of requiring the administrator ex ante to paper their decision-making. That may increase the costs, and then that happens because if there's a challenge, my suggestion is that the burden should be on the administrator to show why they considered that this was the right route to take. So please understand that that's where we are coming from, to improve the system, to improve the quality of the prepacks. If that means that there'll be fewer prepacks, that's not the intention. The intention is to just have good prepacks.
Many thanks, Rees. For me, I'm not sure where to start from. So I would simply echo the fact that I'm not ideologically wedded to anything one way or the other. I would always say I'm too left for the right, too right for the left. And that's always been my own, I think, stance in most things. What I would like in life is a pragmatic response to the challenges that are before me. And the fact is, it is not a problem of our creation. There is a problem, and you want to resolve the problem, and there are good economic reasons why that problem should be resolved in terms of the cost of funding your companies. But I go beyond the economics. It's not the economics of it that perhaps influences me the most. It is a question of how the legal system works and how certain parts of the legal system works. There are certain values that attend to the legal system of this country, and I do not see a reason why a proportion of that legal system can work against the values that exist in the broader legal system. Those are the unspoken assumptions beneath the way that you structure your insolvency system and beneath the values that have been suggested that we bring within the insolvency system. And the challenge that we have here is that the practicalities of the way that the system run against these values that the system professes that it has, and the way that the broader system in this country is said to work. That is the tension that we have here. So now, in terms of the particular situation that faces us here, connected sales are usually the smallest. I'm not saying you ban connected sales. In fact, if you looked at the US, you'd find that well, Chapter 11, that is a debtor in possession system, they would have changes to the directorship of the company. But if you looked at the smaller ends, now Chapter 11 is usually entered into by companies that owe $100 million and above. So if you're looking at the smaller end, your SMEs, your moms and pops, as the US system would call them, they go into the state procedures. And within the state procedures, they have found that they would have business sales closely resemble your Prepack here, and the people who are interested in buying back those businesses would be the people in charge of them before. And even now in the US, to answer Jerry just a little bit, they're also, they've looked longingly across the Atlantic to this country, and they've wanted what this country has, and they're having their own problems dealing with one-day prepacks and the like too. So there is a more, existential problem or question for insolvency law. How should the insolvency law be structured, and how should the insolvency law run? And there's always been this tension. There has always been this tension between the pragmatic and the, I think, the idealistic, or maybe the ideal in terms of that. I'm not saying no to prepacks. I'm not saying no to connected sales. We're not trying to make it harder. We're trying to provide more quality, a system with better quality that gives to the range of people who are implicated in that process. And the question I suppose I have is there a reason why we should not?